Like there is a deep state, but Sean Hannity and Trump are working for it. They're working for the agenda of it. Yet they've got everyone thinking because they mention it, they're going after it.
It's like the scary thing when you realize.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, I guess we're going to get started.
It could be louder.
Simon, am I up? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but it's not very loud. Everything goes back far.
Not really.
There we go. What'd you say, Mark? Again? I can hear you.
Stand up, Jimmy.
You don't want me? I'm kneeling now, actually. We've got a funny crowd here.
Yeah.
That's good.
Right.
Well, there was some confusion on the start time, but we've got a full house, and David's only given me 30 minutes for his introduction.
I see.
So I should get started right away. Well, we're all in for a real treat. It's my extreme pleasure to welcome back to our community David Barsamian, the founder and host of Alternative Radio, which can be heard every Monday at 9 a.m. on KMUD. For 32 years, David has shared the thoughts and ideas of some of the world's most dynamic thinkers and activists, those who push aside the veil of false information, which is the seeming currency of our current government, to unfailingly speak truth to power. His interviews and books with such giants as Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, Arundhati Roy, Ralph Nader, Angela Davis, and many others provide hope and inspiration to light a path in these gloomy times. His new book, Global Discontents, Conversations on the Rising Threats to Democracy, features 12 interviews with Noam Chomsky that explore some of the most crucial challenges around the globe. And of course, copies of that book are available here. It's important to note that Alternative Radio and David's tireless investigative work survive without ads or corporate dollars, which is why it is so important for us to give our support, as he has constantly given his support to community radio and independent media. David's topic this evening is resistance in the age of Trump, something most of us are struggling with, and I greatly look forward to his ideas and direction. And also, despite the relative seriousness of this introduction, talking to him today, I realized once again that David's warm, friendly, and a very funny guy. So please give a warm welcome to David Barsamian.
Well, good evening, Redway and Garberville. Yeah. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces, and it's great to be back in this part of the country and to celebrate this unique institution you have here, KMUD. As I've often mentioned, I travel around, all over the U.S., and there are major cities and towns across the country that would give their eye teeth for a community radio station of the caliber of KMUD. For example, you might think, well, Boston, right? Chomsky's longtime home. Philadelphia, they must have a great community radio station. Miami, Portland, Maine, you go up and down the East Coast, Chicago, Detroit. None of them have a community radio station. So this is a very valuable entity that you have here in your community. So nourish it, cherish it. Is it flawless? Does it make you angry sometimes? Yes, it's not flawless. I'm sure it makes you angry from time to time, but it is a treasure, and I want you all to be actively supporting the station. And so the books back there, which I'll be happy to sign, will be going to KMUD. And that's another way you can be supporting the station.
Thanks, David.
So we're in quite a pickle. I don't have to tell you that. That's Katz's Delicatessen on the Lower East Side of New York, where I used to go, and because they thought I was Jewish, Armenians and Jews are kind of country cousins. They used to give me extra pickles because of that. So we are in dire straits. I don't want to beat around the bush with language that's going to somehow seduce you or placate you. This is a very dangerous moment in the history of this country and for the planet. When you have this all-out assault on Mother Nature just yesterday. And by the way, I will not refer to the occupant of the Oval Office by his name. I'll use euphemisms like the exalted leader or the great leader or the great one, and you'll know who I mean. Just yesterday, the great leader has decided to give 2 million acres of our precious national parklands in Utah, some of the most spectacular areas in the entire country, over to his corporate friends and allies who have been lobbying to drill, to mine, to frack, to extract wealth from Mother Nature, and to boot, accelerate climate change, which is, of course, being denied now at the very highest levels of government. There's a Time magazine is kind of, centrist, I would call, not very radical magazine. It recently had a cover story called The Wrecking Crew, How the Great Leader's Cabinet is Dismantling Government as We Know It. This is not some random, haphazard, improvised campaign to undermine state institutions. It's very much directed, it's ideologically rooted in the ideas of rather obscure economists like James McGill Buchanan and others, the works of Ayn Rand, to deconstruct the administrative state. Those are the words of the great leaders, intellectual mentor, Steve Bannon. And so all government agencies are being hollowed out. People are being put in charge who disagree with the very institutions that they're directing. Most notoriously is Scott Pruitt, the former Attorney General of Oklahoma, who is now the director of the Environmental Protection Agency, which has scrubbed the term climate change from the agency's website. Now you'd think, this is something that probably happened in Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia. It is happening right here. It is one of the many whiffs of fascism that is now detectable. I don't want to frighten you. I just want to make sure that you know what we're up against and what could develop down the road. There are many, many signals that we're being given right now. And in 1928, Hitler and the Nazi Party won a small percentage of the vote. 4 years later, they didn't win a majority, much like the great leader, but he was able to become Chancellor of Germany, and the rest, as they say, is history. So one has to be, I think, also a little rigorous and scrupulous in using terms like fascism, because people immediately jump to Nuremberg rallies and swastikas and concentration camps, and that is certainly one aspect of it. But this is a kind of neo-fascism, and it's not just here in our country or their country. You never know what pronoun to use here. Sometimes I feel it's their country. It's part of a pattern that we're seeing around the world, coming as an endpoint and on the heels of a collapsed economic system called neoliberalism, which has been implemented now over the last 40 years. It has produced stagnant wages. It has produced, massive unemployment, and we find more and more countries moving to the right because of the tremendous fascism develops when there's economic insecurity, when there's also a cultural backlash. And so you get leaders who come along, I'm not naming names, who exploit those fears, who provide simplistic solutions. You are poor, or you're not making ends meet, or you can't pay your son's or your grandson's or your granddaughter's student tuition bill because of, and then fill in the blank. Scapegoating is a classic technique of demagoguery, weaponizing language. So we saw that so clearly, and it continues to this day, when the great leader calls people of my profession and the enemy of the American people. It's a very interesting construct, because if you go back to Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, that's the kind of language that was being invoked at that time. Now, there should also be a place for a little bit of levity after that kind of dire opening. And I've always been inspired by the great radical historian Howard Zinn, who always tried to inject humor amid the doom and gloom. And you know, the left is kind of boring with "comrades, the end is near." That's really going to attract young people, by the way. If the game's over, forget about it. We've lost. There's been way too much negativity and way too much sectarianism, because we divide and conquer ourselves. There's this joke: the left forms a firing squad internally and shoots one another in a circle, right? But the right wing shoots out of the circle, away from their compatriots. So we have a kind of a history of sectarianism. Anyway, I invented a character a few years ago called Dick Veneer. And this is what Dick has to say to you. Dun, 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 dun. We interrupt this program from Redway, California, to bring you this breaking news story from TIBC, the Truth in Broadcasting Corporation, from our world corporate headquarters in our secure, state-of-the-artless underground studios in Roswell, New Mexico. I'm Dick Veneer, your glib and banal anchor of Facade News. Facade News, the 24/7 newscast dedicated to keeping you in the dark. We go straight to the surface of a story, and we stay there. No one can challenge our award-winning, in-shallow reporting. We're dedicated to the highest standards of journalism. We make things up as we go along, unencumbered by elite concepts like the truth. Our award-losing reporters are dedicated to giving you fake news all the time with a thorough and scrupulous disregard for facts. Our credos, unfair and unbalanced. We deceive, you believe. Ladies and gentlemen, an amazing story coming across our news desk at this very moment. Our exalted leader has determined that 2 and 2 is 5. He told Facade News in an exclusive interview that after much soul-searching and consultations with his daughter and son-in-law, that he concludes that long-held views of 2 plus 2 is 4 are wrong. He described the process as amazing while teeing off on the 13th hole at his Bedminster, New Jersey golf course. And he added, the people love the tremendous math work we are doing. The great leader then said, I give myself a 10. Stay tuned for updates on this and other breaking stories right here on Facade News. I'm Dick Veneer, your still glib and banal anchor of Facade News, reminding you, believe our news or else. And now back to your regularly scheduled program in Redway, California.
Is that Sinclair owned? Is that Sinclair owned?
Sorry?
Sinclair owned?
Sinclair owned, not quite. It's part of the Fox network. Well, just today, actually moments ago, we once again have witnessed the real meaning of America First. It really means, in translation, America isolated. The United States today, under the great leader, has decided to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was annexed by the Israeli military in 1967. There is not a single country in the world that recognizes Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem. If there is ever to be peace in the Middle East, if there's ever to be a viable Palestinian state, it has to have this crucial cultural vortex as its capital, and that is East Jerusalem. And so, despite the many urgent pleas from such radical allies as France and Britain and Italy and other countries, the great leader decided to fulfill the dreams of his son-in-law and daughter to move the capital to Jerusalem. This is, in fact, 2017, is the 50th anniversary of the longest military occupation in modern times, Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. And on the ground, there's been a radical shift in demographics because of settlements, which really should be called colonies, and that's what we learned from Chomsky, is to use exact, precise language and not to use euphemisms like settlements. Well, when you hear the settlements, right, it sounds of something very noble, something very positive. You want to settle down somewhere and then you create a settlement. But if you use the term colonizer and colony, I think you have a clearer understanding of what's going on. But the corruption of language is central to ideological control, and I can think of no one better than Noam Chomsky in deconstructing propaganda. Terms like collateral damage, enhanced interrogation techniques. This is to obfuscate and to cloud and to make people confused about what's actually going on. And so for years and years, you've heard the term peace process between Israel and Palestine. And you've also heard that the U.S., our great country, is an honest broker. It is somehow neutral in this dispute between these two communities. Few things can be farther from the truth than describing the U.S. as an honest broker, which is at every international fora and with hundreds of billions of dollars in economic and military aid, is clearly tilted to one side. The whole world knows it. The wool is pulled over the population here because of constant propaganda about those Arabs, and terrorism, of course, then plays into this whole construct of demonizing the other. And the Palestinians cannot catch a break, incidentally. Also, our country is first in leaving UNESCO. Because of, again, this particular issue, claiming that UNESCO, which is a cultural agency, is somehow prejudiced against Israel. So the 600,000 Israelis that now live in what would have been or could still be an independent, viable Palestinian state are an enormous stumbling block and an enormous obstacle to peace. So, America first really means America isolated. America pulls out of the Paris Climate Accord. 195 countries signed off on this accord. There were two that were not part of that initially, Nicaragua and Syria. Syria because I think probably because of the war and administrative issues it might have. But Nicaragua was holding out for a stronger Paris Accord. They felt it wasn't strong enough. It was too compromising. There were too many loopholes, and it certainly had no enforcement mechanism. It's all it relies on voluntary compliance. But Nicaragua has now signed, and Syria has signed, again, leaving America first, America isolated. America pulled out of the Iran deal, which didn't have the entire world's backing, but it did, literally, not figuratively, in that the 5 Security Council members and Germany, so Russia, China, France, England, and Germany, and the U.S. had signed this agreement, and now that is being abrogated unilaterally by the by the Oval Office occupant, and this clearly, along with North Korea, is certainly a possible area of military action. Kind of, as the ship goes down, there can be massive distractions with flag waving and parades and, homonyms about our brave men and women in uniform who protect us and defend liberty and freedom, and we have to honor them with this soundtrack in the background of, America, America. This is, very reminiscent of Leni Riefenstahl's film, The Triumph of the Will, made in 1934, I believe, at a Nuremberg rally, a brilliant work of propaganda. You should all see how Hitler was able to win over large numbers of people. Let's not forget that 62 million of our fellow citizens voted for the current occupant of the White House. I mean, that's quite a chilling statistic, and even though he did not win the majority vote, it's still very disturbing that so many people, did turn out to vote for someone who has a deep connection with the corporate state, who is hyper-nationalistic and is accumulating wealth for himself and his family at an unprecedented rate. So it helps, as Chomsky says, to know a little bit about history, because if you have historical amnesia, then any charlatan can come along and, again, totally take you for a ride. So I did a little bit of research into this term, America First. And what did I find? Well, it was a term and a political party in the 1930s led by Charles Lindbergh, who was a great American hero. In 1927, he flew solo from New York to Paris, the first person to do that. And he was infatuated with Nazi Germany. He visited that country in the late 1930s. He met with Goering, he praised the Luftwaffe, he talked about the organized vitality of the society. Yeah, everybody was marching in lockstep, if you call that organized vitality. And he said that we have to stay out of a war in Europe because the most precious thing we have is our European blood. So that should not be spilled. But there are forces that are agitating for U.S. Involvement in the war, and those forces are led by Jews. I'm almost quoting here verbatim. Jews who control the government and the media, etc., and have only, evil intentions. So it would be interesting to know if the great leader was aware that America First had these historical backgrounds. And I grew up on the Upper East Side in Manhattan in an area called Germantown, Yorkville, and I'm too young to remember. I was born in 1945, but my older two brothers and my sister watched parades up and down 86th Street of the German-American Bund, which was an openly fascist party organization aligned with America First, with swastikas and portraits of Hitler freely going up and down the streets. And there has been an enormous resurgence of anti-Jewish hatred in this country, in addition to all the other minorities that have been targeted, African Americans, Latinos, LGBTQ community, and others. And that's why I say this is an extremely dangerous time, and this is a time for resistance. This is not a time for fence straddling, for, hedging your bets and saying, well, I'll see how the cookie crumbles. And, it is a time for people to get involved. And I always invoke Pastor Martin Niemöller. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was, by the way, a decorated officer who served on a U-boat in the German Navy in World War I. He won the Iron Cross. After the war ended, for whatever reasons, I'm not quite sure, he became a Lutheran minister, he became a pacifist, and he was part of the anti-Nazi resistance. And he's most well known for his kind of poem called First They Came For. And I'm going to recite that with a little bit of an update given the modern conditions. Well, first they came for the Muslims, and I didn't speak up because, hey, I wasn't a Muslim. Then they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak up. I wasn't part of any union. Then they came for the lesbians, gays, transgender community. Well, I certainly wasn't one of them. I didn't say anything. Then they came for the communists and the socialists. Well, I wasn't, political at that time, so I didn't speak up. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left. So we are in that kind of situation where we cannot be passive in the face of the very destructive power that is arrayed against us. Citizen power can overcome this, but it requires our also being skillful in terms of overcoming sectarian differences. And so that has historically been something that has limited the left here in this country and has prevented really strong movements from taking root and getting stronger. And there are groups in this community, in this state, around the country, Indivisible, 350.org, Code Pink, lots of things going on around there. Black Lives Matter, it's a very important development. There are people in the streets, right? And right now, what is needed is getting you and others off of Facebook and into the face of these people with power. Making them uncomfortable. Even if you have to go to Darrell Issa's office in Anaheim, or somehow put pressure on him and the other right-wingers in this state that are enabling one of the greatest robberies in history in broad daylight going on, and that is the tax bill. If people knew the details of what this bill entails, they would be outraged. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens are going to lose health care. This is an open attack on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Why do they say that? It has mandated austerity cuts. Whether you like it or not, it's in that legislation. So this is, again, another example of making America great again by enriching the 1% and the 1/10 of 1%. And it was Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who was appointed by Woodrow Wilson, who said, you can have democracy in America, or you can have great concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few, but you can't have both. And that's what we have seen in recent years. In this 4-decade period, mostly bipartisan, and one must say objectively, supported by both political parties with some nuance differences, that has led to this crisis in capitalism and the policies which are going to be extremely destructive and hurtful. Falsely, and here you have the role of propaganda, again, why KMUD and other independent institutions are so important to fight the power, because one of their techniques is to isolate us, to keep us separate, to keep us atomized, and to give you a false sense of identity through the nation, the flag. It's exactly what Hitler did. You are part of, das Volk, the people. It became almost a mystical religion. It was something much larger. And so you were separated in one instance, but also connected to this mystical outside force. So beware of a lot of flag waving, beware of, charlatans who come along and who want to manipulate and control the public discourse. Thomas Merton said years ago, a falsely informed public with a distorted view of political reality and an oversimplified negative attitude toward other races and peoples cannot be expected to react in any other way than with irrational and violent responses. So information is so critical in terms of not just reinforcing ourselves, and sometimes, I'm criticized, well, you're always preaching to the choir. Well, the choir needs encouragement. The choir needs to know, you need to know that you're okay. It's a system that is corrupt and that has been flooded with gazillions of dollars, particularly since the infamous Citizens United decision of January 2010. That took the remaining hinges off all the doors and all the windows, and enabled more and more secret money to flood into the political system. And we see how so many of our so-called representatives in Washington are connected to big money, whether it's the money written by Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers or Rebecca and Robert Mercer or Steven Schwartzman or Stephen Cohen or any of these big hedge fund operators and private equity firms in New York. Whoops, let's get that recording here, all right. And I want to mention a little bit about Antonio Gramsci, one of my heroes and inspirations. Not terribly well known. He was born in Sardinia in 1891, and he died in a Mussolini jail in 1937. He was imprisoned from 1926 to 1937. His crime? Thought crimes. He was a socialist, he was a Marxist, he was the General Secretary of the Communist Party in Italy. He was also an editor of a very important leftist newspaper, and that, of course, didn't sit well with El Duce, Mussolini, the founder of the first fascist party in the 20th century in 1915. He seized power after the March on Rome in 1922, and he remained in power until 1943. So, and he was definitely someone who inspired Adolf Hitler. Anyway, Gramsci talked about civilizations when they're in decline give rise to all kinds of morbid symptoms. For example, chemtrails and vast conspiracy theories. This is not to say that conspiracies don't exist, but really kind of irrational belief in magical thinking. So a growth in magical thinking, can pigs fly, do raccoons speak Hindi, and things like that. And I was in Boulder and Denver recently, and I went around and these posters struck my eye. This is from Denver Near-Death Studies. Open doors, open hearts, afterlife, contacts from beyond. Missing your dear mother, your beloved sister who passed away. Now, if you join this weekend seminar and pay thousands of dollars, you can talk to them again. So that's in Denver. Then I was in Madison about a month ago, and this was on a kiosk, and my eyes just jumped on it because it says, Meditation Crash Course. Really? Holding it up to the camera. How can you have a crash course in meditation? Hear Buddhist teachings, learn how to meditate, meet Buddhists, and see how they practice. So join up. It's again another weekend. But this is my all-time favorite. And I just got this a couple of months ago. I particularly like this one because its claim is so subtle and understated. The greatest event in history is now unfolding. I was worried. I thought they were going to say, this is one of the greatest events. No, this is the greatest event in history. What is it? Maitreya, the teacher for all humanity, is in the world. Join us for a presentation of unfolding world events from a spiritual perspective. Learn about the relationship between UFOs and the spiritual hierarchy of our planet. Come to Boulder, come to Denver, 2 different dates and times. Sign up now. So, that might give you a chuckle, but, I think it speaks to some dis-ease that is out there. Now, that was, one aspect of Gramsci's teaching. He also said, in the face of overwhelming odds, in his case, imprisoned, tortured by Mussolini, that we should have pessimism of the intellect. That is to say, we see things clearly, we don't obfuscate or make them arcane in any way, but we have optimism of the will, that we can overcome these things and create a better world. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who reminded us time and time again that it's better to be on your feet fighting for justice and human rights and dignity than on your knees begging the master. While the master owns the bakery, the wheat, the sugar, the milk, and we're given a few crumbs, and the master expects us to kiss his hand. It's usually a man, so I'm using his deliberately. That's the kind of situation that we're in, where action is so much needed. We cannot be good Germans. We cannot pretend we didn't know what was happening, as 800,000 people are being threatened with deportation at this very moment. At the Denver jail, my colleague told me that it's full now of people that have been picked up by ICE. There is resistance to that. There's resistance here in California with the sanctuary movement. This is a very important human rights issue. These people, almost all of them, came to this country at a very young age. They've worked here, they've paid taxes, they've educated themselves, they're contributing to society, and they are, of course, being scapegoated by the great leader who keeps talking about, building higher and higher walls and, protecting us from vermin and these criminals. I mean, if you listen to the great leader, just like Kim Jong-un, you would think that, America is in a state of absolute war internally. He mentioned that in the inaugural address, that America is in carnage. This is right out of Bannon's, playbook. It's Bannon that's feeding these ideas to the great leader, and he is just kind of the mouthpiece. You would think, from listening to these tirades, that Salvadoran gangs are running the country. They're everywhere. I don't know about, Garberville and Redway, but if you go to San Francisco, Sacramento, they're everywhere, right? Boulder, Denver, they've taken over. We're going to have to all speak Spanish. That wouldn't be a bad idea, by the way. So that kind of fear-mongering plays to an audience that is vulnerable, that is scared, that has tremendous economic and social insecurity because they can't deal with diversity. They can't deal with the sexual revolutions that have happened and are happening. And so we see that boomeranging into blind support for extremely destructive policies. But we are many. Howard Zinn closes his masterpiece, A People's History of the United States, with the famous couplet from Shelley: "Rise like lions after slumber, shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." Let's not forget that in terms of our numbers. And there were some encouraging things in the recent November election, particularly in the area of diversity. The first ever openly transgender person was elected to a political office in the state of Virginia. And women and people of color scored victories all over the country. That needs to be built on in terms of future movements. So elections do have consequences.
A good deal of socialists, too.
And some socialists as well. Thanks to Bernie Sanders, the most Googled term in 2016 was socialism. Young people in particular have gravitated to socialism. There was just a major conference in New York that immediately sold out. They had to double the capacity rent another huge hall, and that too was immediately sold out, with lines of young people going around the block trying to get in. It was like a rock concert, and I think we can thank, to some extent, the senator from Vermont, formerly from Brooklyn, New York, who has, some difficulty saying water, but has plenty of ideas, and so we all love ideas. But Sanders did a remarkable thing. He won 13 million votes. He won 22 primaries and caucuses, and probably would have won the nomination, and certainly would have trumped the great leader in the general election, had not the National Democratic Party undermined him under W. Wasserman Schultz and the Clintons. There was a concerted campaign to deny Sanders crucial funding, to deny him logistical support, and to allow superdelegates, which is, if you think about it for a second, it's a very totalitarian mechanism. Where do these people come from? Who elected them? They're party hacks, they're insiders, and that also, almost to a person, all of these superdelegates, of whom there were 115, they all went with the eventual nominee in opposition to Bernie Sanders. So there was, a lot there that we could learn from in terms of going forward, what's going to happen politically. But Chris Hedges always asks the question, and he's someone I've featured on alternative radio multiple times, always asks this question rhetorically. How many times can you be led to the altar by the National Democratic Party and be disappointed? How many rings disappear at that crucial moment? How many I-do's are never articulated at that moment? So it's, I'm putting that out there. Some people say, well, we need a third party. I think we need a second party, a real choice for people. Not one, and particularly on foreign policy. On U.S. imperialism, there's not much difference between the two major parties. There's very little daylight. There's an enormous amount of agreement about, America's role in the world. And again, a very innocuous kind of Hollywood-sounding term, right? We all have roles to play. And of course, America's role is to be the dominant hegemon, is to control natural resources, control, circle China with military bases, stoke up Cold War fevers again with former enemies. We have over 800 military bases, $1 trillion being spent on the military. By the way, Brown University, not noted to be a center of Marxist-Leninist, thought, recently issued a very well-researched and documented report saying that the war on terror, which was launched by the other great president we've had recently, George W., on September 12, 2001, will cost, by the end of next fiscal year, $5.5 trillion. $5.5 trillion. So when they say, hey, there's no money for Social Security, there's no money for Medicare and Medicaid, there's no money to protect the environment, there's no money for health care, we cannot possibly have single health care payer movement here because there's no cash. There's plenty of cash. The Pentagon has been sucking out all of the discretionary income, and the military-industrial complex has grown so powerful that Eisenhower, who described this on January 20th, 1961, warning the country, he wouldn't recognize the United States today. Also, Eisenhower probably would not have a place in either political party. He would be regarded as some kind of weird outsider. We had funny ideas about the military-industrial complex. We have 10 aircraft carrier battle groups. I mention that because no other country has one. And when you have, I'm talking about aircraft carrier battle groups, that doesn't just mean the aircraft carrier, it means the hundreds of jets, the pilots, the Marines on those ships, the destroyers, the submarines, the minesweepers, the cruisers, all of those things spread out around the world into American lakes. And now we have geographical command zones. There's the Africa Command, there's the Asia Command, there's the Latin American Command. I mean, it's an empire on the scale that Rome could only dream of.
But we don't have a Death Star yet.
We don't have a Death Star yet, but we might get there. Now, Stephen Biko was a great African liberationist. He was murdered by the apartheid regime in that country. He said before his murder, the most powerful tool in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So we too have to decolonize ourselves. We too have to, use language precisely and to expose the kinds of tricks that are used to block meaning. So let's take again, the use of euphemisms. I gave you a few examples before, but also of the passive voice. So the war was a tragedy. People were killed. The village was bombed. There's no agency there. You don't know why the war was a tragedy. You don't know who started the war, who bombed the village, who killed the people. So again, language is very, very important, and Chomsky is, I think, right at the top of the list in decoding the propaganda. And this particular new book, which everyone here has to get, you cannot leave without it, and I'll be happy to sign it at no extra charge, and you'll be supporting KMUD. This is our 11th book. As I sometimes quip, if the Guinness Book of Records had a section or a category for most interviews with Noam Chomsky, I might be the winner of that. But I think this is our best one. It's carefully edited. It's very tight. And incidentally, Noam Chomsky will be 89 years old tomorrow.
Wow.
How about that? Still working, still on the side of the underdog, still on the side of justice and freedom and human rights. And just a little bit, a background, because people always ask me, how did you, meet Chomsky? I wrote him a letter. Anyone here remember letters, stamps? Okay, it was an old form of communication. It's now, you can find it in various museums. And to my surprise, he wrote back. Usually when you write to celebrities, you get a perfunctory, response from an assistant, or something to the effect of, thanks for writing, appreciate your thoughts, goodbye. But he wrote back, and then that started a back and forth. And we did our first interview in 1984 on politics and the English language, which is actually a title of one of George Orwell's most important essays. And that was the first program we did, and started doing books. I finally met him in 1986 when he came to Boulder. The first interview was by phone, and subsequent ones were as well, until I met him in 86, and then we connected. He's a very humble man. I mean, he's really someone unique in many ways. He's probably, he's given credit for actually inventing the academic field of linguistics. He's a pioneer in that respect. But also he's always been there for the downtrodden and the disadvantaged. And there are no power plays with him. With a lot of famous people, you feel somehow, they make you feel uncomfortable, or, you're not so smart, or you're not as smart as I am. There's none of that. I often tell the story, which is true. I was there. He was giving an interview to a 7th or 8th grader writing a report for the middle school newspaper. I mean, how important is that? But he was giving this student complete and total attention, as if he were the most important person in the world. And so really practicing that egalitarianism, not just mouthing it, but actually practicing it. And in the adjoining office, there's a Nobel Prize winner waiting to see him. He can wait because Chomsky's busy talking to this young kid. And so there are many aspects of his work and also of his personality that I think are worth emulating in terms of his enormous contribution. And Alexander Cockburn passed away a few years ago, who used to live in Petrolia, not very far from here. He used to joke that, the two greatest disasters to befall the United States in the 20th century both happened on December 7th, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Noam Chomsky's birthday. So Noam is very, very special. And speaking of past artifacts of life, I see there are a few people here over the age of 50, just a couple. Do you remember a course in school called penmanship? No. Okay. It was the art of writing clearly. I know this is, something you can find now in, deep caves, hidden underground, Carlsberg Cavern in New Mexico and elsewhere. The reason I say that is when I pass out this, I won't pass it up, I'll pass it out. When I go back to Boulder, I can't read 3/4 of the names of the scribbles. So if you'd like to get on my mailing list so I can keep in touch, please do so. If you did get something from the Boulder office of Alternative Radio, a huge office, by the way, well over 600 square feet, staffed by myself and 2 other people, you're most welcome to come by in Boulder. Next time you're in Boulder, come by and visit. We'd love to welcome you. Sign up for the tour before all the Chinese tourists, descend upon us, and we can't accommodate the huge crowds. But if you did get a message from our Boulder office, then you are on our list. If you didn't, please sign up. And rest assured, I won't share this with the NSA or the FBI because they already have all your information. And this is always an awkward moment as well in any lecture I give, and that is after denouncing capitalism and its predatory, rapacious capacity to destroy the earth and all the earthlings on it, I have to resort to a little bit of capitalist huckstering myself, but I think this is for a good cause. It's to support alternative radio. 4 brand new programs, 4 one-hour programs featuring Richard Wolff on capitalism versus socialism, Henry Giroux, who's absolutely brilliant. He teaches in Canada, not terribly well known, but he's at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, talking about Orwell, Huxley, and the new authoritarianism. Nancy MacLean, a brilliant woman on the origins of radical right-wing power, and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, wonderful Native American historian on genocide to resistance. So they're all 4 of these one-hour CDs for $20. If you got them from Boulder, it would be $75. So that's the bargain. Plus there are free catalogs here every week. We have programs on KMUD, as was mentioned, Mondays at 9 o'clock. We just finished Jason Stanley on how fascism works. Alfred McCoy, you may have heard, on 2030, the end of American empire. We also just did a program on the JFK assassination with Michael Parenti, JFK and the Gangster State, War and Peace in Korea, and on and on. So alternative radio is out there, providing hopefully inspiration and information to more and more people. And I'm really glad KMUD's signal has expanded into southern Humboldt County because KHSU, in its great wisdom and sagacity, has chosen to give us a Thursday 2 to 3 a.m. slot. And as I sadly comment, we've got all the deer and raccoons out there listening, but not many people. So if any of you have connections with the station there, urge them to give a better time to alternative radio. That's one way dissent is marginalized. So we're not put in gulags or in concentration camps. We're just shoved off into the corner, like the one and only time Chomsky has ever been on the NewsHour, which is the flagship PBS station, right? It's very polite. People don't yell. They seem to have a command of adverbs and adjectives and prepositions. They speak in complete sentences. He was on in 1990. I remember it as if it were yesterday. Iraq had just invaded Kuwait, and Chomsky was invited to give his opinion on what had just happened. Well, he started talking about U.S. support for Saddam Hussein throughout the 1980s, which is indisputable, unambiguous, well documented, to the tune of billions of dollars. And he was also talking about history. History is a very, charged subject, and the fact that Kuwait was cut off from Iraq by the British imperialists at the end of World War I, when they were slicing and dicing the entire Middle East, including Palestine and Syria, Lebanon, creating, these imperial cartographers creating states where no states had existed, like Jordan, for example, and allowing for the Balfour Declaration, also coming from London. This is the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. That was the enabling document that the Zionists used to give them legal standing to create the state of Israel at the expense of the indigenous population, which was in the majority, way in the majority at that time. So Kuwait was lopped off from Iraq, and Kuwait was side drilling into Iraqi oil fields, the Rumaila oil fields. And Saddam Hussein was greatly agitated about this. Chomsky could not finish a sentence. He was, what do you mean, interrupted with, what do you mean, what do you mean? Could you explain that? That goes against everything we know, and that kind of thing. And finally, they said, we've run out of time, Professor. Thank you and good night. So you can watch this on YouTube, by the way. It's very instructive. That's the one and only time, I think, in the 35-plus year history of that program. Occasionally, once in a blue moon, he's on NPR, your dearly beloved, Some Things Considered, the afternoon newscast, as well as Morning Edition, MOURNING, where you get a huge diversity of opinion, way out there, from A to B. So you get debates about, let's say, North Korea or Iran. So the question would be, and the experts would be this retired major general versus this retired four-star general. Well, what about Iran? Can the Iranians be trusted? That's the question from the anchor. Okay, yeah. So then there's a debate. Well, maybe, but you've got to, verify. And the other guy says, no way. They're duplicitous. They're deceptive. They're, innate liars and the like. You'll notice that the question is never asked if the United States can be trusted. We who break international treaties and UN Security Council resolutions on a regular basis, that question is never posed. It cannot even be articulated, much less, conceived. And so that is very telling in terms of how the system works. So should we attack North Korea now, or should we wait for 2 months? And ramp up the sanctions, and that's the debate. How about ending the Korean War? Is that question even posed? Do you know that the United States, this was the first of the major interventions that did not get congressional approval, and now that has become the norm. These are executive White House wars. The first one was in Korea from 1950 to 1953. How many of you know that there's no peace treaty between the United States, South Korea, and North Korea? We are still in a state of war. That might be a very good way to get the attention of Kim Jong-un and legitimize his regime, because that's what he wants. He wants legitimacy, and he wants to perpetuate his power. So ending the war in a formal negotiation could be a very positive first step, but it's not even mentioned. We keep moving the goalposts. We keep changing the rules of the game. So when I go to Jordan, as I was there in early April, when I was in Armenia in June, when I was in Turkey and Lebanon and Iran last year, this came up over and over again. We cannot trust the Americans. They keep changing the rules of the game. And so, what's going on? And even more so now, how is it that a country can give more votes to one candidate and fewer votes to the other candidate, and the one who got fewer votes is elected? They don't get that. There isn't a country in the world that has this antediluvian relic from the slave plantation days like the Electoral College. Anti-democratic. I mean, it's simply unheard of. And you know what's really interesting? You talk about, the Democrats and their cojones. Not a single Democrat has talked about abolishing the Electoral College. You'd think after losing 2 of the last 5 presidential elections that might be a topic that would come up, that might energize the base. We always hear about their base, right? The great leaders' base. What about our base? Are we out there? We're out there in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions. So many people didn't vote in 2016 because of their utter disgust with the tweedledum, tweedledee Demopublicans, Demopublicans and Republicrats parties. That, is something that should, I think, be addressed. And it's curious that they're not doing it. One has to wonder. Again, there's this wonderful quote from Orwell, and let me talk a little bit about the importance of art in resistance, because art is the thing, has the power, as Emma Goldman reminds us, to give ideas life and force and power. And so through art, through music, through dance, through theater, poetry, we are not only inspired and uplifted, let me not forget dance and all the other painting and all the other arts, we are inspired that we can imagine that another world is possible. Because the artist's imagination can leap into spaces that some of us cannot conceptualize. And so right now, there's been, just a tremendous interest in novels. If you notice, for example, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. These are novels. Orwell's 1984, as well as Animal Farm. And if you really want to read an interesting book about imperialism, Burmese Days by Orwell. And the great work on imperialism is the novella Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. If you want to understand capitalism, read or see Death of a Salesman. It's, I believe, available on a lot of the web stream sites. You can see Oliver Stone's 2-part series. They're really bookends, Wall Street and Wall Street 2, Money Never Sleeps. There it is, Gordon Gekko, telling a group of investors, greed is good. It is a bald, unvarnished picture of how the capitalist system works in terms of being cutthroat and predatory. No prisoners. It's all about the bottom line. It's all about net income. The planet be damned. Future generations be damned. That's their problem. To these CEOs who control the masters of the universe, who control the economy, and who have someone in the White House that is literally carrying out their demands with this tax bill and selling off or giving away 2 million acres of precious national forest in Utah. You have can someone get me some water, please? Thank you. So art is very, very important. That should be part of resistance. And I think in a lot of these demonstrations, you see the puppets, you see the dancing, the music. Don't forget, as Howard Zinn reminds us, almost every great artist has been with us, on our side. From Mark Twain to Bruce Springsteen, from all of these people that have been writing, from Charles Dickens up to the present age. They are on our side, and I think that tells you a lot that is really positive. And unconscious people and indoctrinated people are people fed only on partisan information and opinion that confirm their own bias, a people made morbidly obese in mind and spirit by the junk food of propaganda is less inclined to put up a fight, to ask questions and be skeptical. That kind of orthodoxy can kill a democracy. And those are the words of Henry Giroux that Canadian professor. Actually, he's a U.S. citizen, but he teaches in Canada, and that's in this particular program. I've also been reading recently a wonderful book that came out in the 80s called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. And I just came across this passage once again. When a population becomes distracted by trivia, when cultural life is redefined as a perpetual round of entertainments, when serious public conversation becomes a form of baby talk, when, in short, a people become an audience and their public business a vaudeville act, then a nation finds itself at risk. And so when you have segments of the population that know more about the Kardashians than about legislation in Sacramento or in Washington, we are at serious risk. When they know more about Kobe Bryant's retirement, when they know more about whether John Carlos Stanton will sign with the San Francisco Giants, than what's going on around the world, we are in serious jeopardy. So the media function as a weapon of mass distraction. So there's, again, the focus on the latest divorce, the latest scandal, the latest, the celebrity-itis, which has so much polluted public discourse. There's so much focus on the foibles of the rich and the famous. And let me say, right now, we are at a historic moment that I'm very glad to see that all of these women now are speaking up and speaking out and breaking the silence that has been enforced on them, not for decades, but for centuries. So it's a very important and powerful and liberating moment when, this thing is happening, and we should all be celebrating that and supporting women coming forward and speaking the truth. Because on their side of the ledger, I'm talking about the right wing, they have the Drudge Report, they have Red State, they have Breitbart News, they have InfoWars with Alex Jones. And people always have been for years asking me about Alex Jones and whether I've listened to him and what are his theories about this or that conspiracy. I've now been listening to and reading some of these websites like Tablet, like altright.com, full of anti-Jewish slanders, particularly around Harvey Weinstein, who's always described as a fat Jew perv. Perversion is a common word attached to Harvey Weinstein and the fact that he happens to be Jewish. You don't see them talking about fat Christians pervs, but fat Jewish pervs. So this poison that is in the aquifer, the racism, the misogyny, the patriarchy, is now enabled by the occupant in the Oval Office, by his calling neo-Nazis marching in the streets of Charlottesville as very fine people. These were people, incidentally, openly brandishing weaponry as well as Nazi symbols, and chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and "White lives matter," and chanting all kinds of things that we thought we were beyond this, right? Well, we're not. It's there. It's in the aquifer, and it takes someone of the caliber or lack of caliber of the great leader to ignite that hate and that tremendous loathing that some people have. So again, creating an opposition force is so important. Getting off the fence, getting involved, finding something to do. If all you can do is write a check to support one of these organizations, it's not a bad thing. Really. If that's the limit of your activism, it's fine. We need money. KMUD needs money. Alternative Radio needs money. Code Pink needs money. Find the organization that you feel is a kindred spirit and support it. Get involved if you can, but if all you can do is write a check, fabulous. Help them out. I want to conclude. That's a bit of an applause line. Right, finally, with some poetry. Now, I don't know if No, I'm going to interrupt myself again as a double Gemini. I have that privilege. Sometimes the ruling class, and we have classes in this country, nobody knows it better than the occupant of the Oval Office right now. Sometimes they speak the truth. So a few years ago, Warren Buffett, who's not exactly a poor person, one of the richest in the world, he said there is absolute class war being waged in this country, and my class, meaning the upper class, the rich, are winning that war. And the class which has the power to rob upon a large scale has also the power to control the government and legalize their robbery. That was said by Eugene Victor Debs, who ran for president of the United States 4 times on the socialist ticket. One time while he was in jail for opposing U.S. entry into World War I. Woodrow Wilson put him in jail, and that was the beginning of the Red Scare, which crushed a lot of radical organizations, deported people like Alexander Berkman and Rosa Luxemburg and other radicals, sent them on their way, purged unions from socialists, mostly people from Southern Europe. And Debs got more than 1 million votes while he was in jail. He couldn't campaign, which shows you the strength of socialism and its message until it was targeted for elimination, as it were. There was a massive propaganda, that this was some kind of Russian, Jewish, Bolshevik, communist plot to undermine democracy in America. And so we see that. And of course, the great goal of the propaganda system here is to convince we the people that everything is just hunky-dory, a few sacrifices have to be made, and as if this tax bill is not going to attack the most vulnerable middle class, people who earn less than $75,000 a year. I think that might be almost everyone in this room. Your taxes will be going up dramatically under this tax bill, which is called a tax cut or a tax relief. If we had honesty in language, it would be called a ripoff. It would be called the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the United States, from the lower and middle classes, up, siphoned off and siloed up to the very rich. So this isn't, again, a time for complacency. They've got an enormous amount of power, and they intend to use it in dramatic ways to pauperize the rest of the country and to destroy the environment, to make future life on this planet more and more problematic. So when you hear terms like the national interest, know that it's propaganda. It's nothing to do with the national interest. It's the interest of corporate capitalism. It's the interest of imperialism. But they never say that. They never tell you, why does the United States has a national interest in Saudi Arabia, the most feudalistic, misogynist, patriarchal regime on the face of the earth. That's the first place, the first country the great leader went to visit was Saudi Arabia. And you remember he did his little warrior sword dance with these feudal monarchs. Saudi Arabia is not, you can't even think of it as a country. It's like the Waltons running Walmart. It's a privately run family business. The Saud dynasty controls Saudi Arabia, as the Asaba family runs Kuwait, as the other emirs in the United Arab Emirates run those little mini countries. It's better to call them fiefdoms. So those are our allies, and Saudi Arabia we have been in bed with the Saudis since February 12, 1945, when Franklin D. Roosevelt went to the Suez Canal on his way back from Yalta, where he had just met with Stalin and Churchill. He was dying, he was deathly ill, and he would die actually 2 months after meeting with 3 monarchs in the Suez Canal on a U.S. destroyer called the Quincy. He met with King Farouk of Egypt, King Healy Selassie of Ethiopia, and most importantly, Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. That's where the die was cast. That's where the deal was made to protect. The United States guaranteed the security of the Saudi monarchy in return for what?
Oil.
Whoa!
Freedom.
Freedom and democracy and free markets, yeah. Unimpeded access for U.S. corporations to Saudi oil. No British, no French, they were cut out. And that has continued till this day. So this is 1945. This is 3 years before the creation of the State of Israel. So when people say, it's all about Israel, no, it's not all about Israel. It's partly about Israel, but it's mostly about our alliances with decrepit monarchs or dictators like Hosni Mubarak, like Ali Saleh in Yemen, Ben Ali in Tunisia. Gaddafi was an on-again, off-again ally. That's been the policy. We want stability. Stability is another term of propaganda. We want moderate leaders. A moderate leader is someone who obeys orders from Washington. Stability is a tightly run dictatorship where U.S. corporations can operate with no impediments, with no constraints. These are, again, the terms of propaganda. Aggression is for designated enemies, just like international law is to be applied to designated enemies. So if Putin's Russia invades Crimea, that's an act of aggression. But if we invade, should I go down the list? Yemen, Somalia, Niger, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, that's not aggression. That's self-defense. I mean, it's way beyond Orwell. It's way beyond 1984 in terms of how the language is being used to manipulate us. So I did promise to go into some poetry because I think it's very important that we have that aspect as part of our fight back, as it were. So where are these things? I'm coming to them. My goodness. Sorry. Well, we're going to start with, and as I'm looking for it, I know it's here somewhere, Fez Ahmed Fez. I'm sure all of you speak Urdu. It's the national language of Pakistan, spoken in Kashmir and parts of North India. Incidentally, I'm now in my 7th year of being banned from traveling to India because I report on Kashmir, something that Hindu nationalists don't like at all because they're committing great human rights violations there and killing tens of thousands of people, torturing hundreds of thousands more. So it's a very painful kind of price that I'm paying. And Faiz Ahmed Faiz, very unusual. His first name and his last name is the same, F-A-I-Z. He was born in Sialkot in 1911 during the British Raj. That's in Punjab, which is now in Pakistan, that part of Punjab. And he was a trade unionist and proud of it. He was a journalist and proud of it. He was a communist and proud of it. And he was a poet and proud of it. And his most famous poem is called Bol, B-O-L. So now you know the imperative in Hindi and in Urdu to speak. So someone says, Bol means to speak. And everywhere you go in South Asia today, and he died in 1984, you see this signs, people with placards holding up signs saying, Bol. Bol ke lab azad hai tere. Speak, your lips are still free. Speak, your body is still yours. Speak, although there is little time, there is enough time. Speak while you still can speak. Bol, bol, bol. Faiz Ahmed Faiz.
Yeah.
Pretty simple, huh? And straightforward. Now, for some reason, well hidden. And speaking of India, I love Arundhati Roy. She's been on alternative radio multiple times. She's an ally and a friend. Sometimes I suspect that one of the other reason I'm being banned from India is because of my promoting her work and propagating her ideas around the world through alternative radio. But this is what she said, and it speaks to today. We can't talk about hope until we grasp reality. If we don't grasp reality, then everything we do is futile because we are appealing to a system that can't be appealed to. It is disheartening, but once we understand the paradigm of power, then we can begin to act to challenge and change that power system. But that requires a clear understanding of where we are. It's late in the game, but there is still time. Fortunately, power has a shelf life. When the time comes, maybe this mighty empire will, like others before it, overreach itself and implode from within. It looks as though structural cracks have already appeared. She wrote this right after 9/11, so 16 years ago. The time has come, Roy says. The time has come, the walrus said. Perhaps things will get worse and then better. Perhaps there's a small goddess up in heaven readying herself for us. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. Arundhati Roy. Another favorite poet is Marge Piercy. I think the last time I was here, I read from her collection, The Moon is Always Female. There's a fabulous poem in there about solidarity called The Low Road. But this is a more recent poem called We Give Up Far Too Easily. Why do people get so discouraged about political action? You take vitamin pills and imagine they do something. You don't say, I'll never wash the dishes again because they'll just get dirty. We all mumble silly prayers into the air. Oh, please, please, don't let me miss the plane or the bus. Oh, please, please, let him call me back. Inaction certainly will work fine for the overlords who own our work, control our lives, consider us collateral loss in their grand schemes. They only fear masses in motion. A little at a time is the way forward, an unending dance, 2 steps forward and 1.5 back. Sitting on your ass too long makes you one. Marge Piercy. And for a real dose of reality and political oratory, I refer you to Frederick Douglass, who in August of 1857 delivered this particular speech. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom, yet deprecate agitation, are men and women who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the mighty roar of its waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And in the words of Daniel Webster, and Ralph Nader is the one who reminded me of the words of Daniel Webster, the great struggle for humankind on earth is a struggle for justice. And that's what we are engaged in, and I hope you are as well. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah!
David, are all of your audiences on an average age of about 70 years old?
No, actually. There were a lot of young people at Northtown Books last night. I was at Kansas State University last Thursday in Lawrence, Kansas, and they were all teenagers. I was talking to a journalism class and another class and students. On Friday, I spoke to a Save the Media group in Kansas City. By the way, there's yet another huge assault on democracy, and that is the FCC is going to end net neutrality. This is really dangerous. It's on February 14th. I know there's going to be actions against Verizon and the other big mega corporations that would benefit from the end of net neutrality. AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast. So I think this area is served by Verizon. There's going to be strikes and blockades and pickets of Verizon offices all over the country on December 7th, tomorrow, Chomsky's birthday. What a great way to celebrate.
Yeah.
So, by the way, no one can leave without getting a book. So you've got to get a book, and I'll be happy to sign them. And the CDs, of course. Yes?
Yeah, the Republicans don't seem to have any problem at all with coming up with new language to frame things. But I never hear the Democrats doing, except maybe Charles Schumer says something stupid, really idiotic.
It's a better deal.
Yeah, right. And I was wondering about a couple of terms that I've been using. For example, class war, ruling elites, plutocracy, as in the people we need to get out of Congress and the Senate and the White House are the plutocratic candidates, not the Republicans only. And calling the people who have, for 35 years, kept us on the fossil fuel path, and now the ice sheets are collapsing and 20 feet of sea level rise is guaranteed, calling them traitors. In fact, I call the Republicans the Republican American Traitor Party, or the Rats. So I was wondering what you think about those.
I echo your sentiments. It's, right on.
And, well, what do you think about Rachel Maddow talking so much about Russia invading or attacking our elections, but not talking at all about how we've done it and invaded, except for Ali Velshi doing like 5 minutes. No one else on MSC talks about what we've been doing.
Yeah. I'm not a fan, and I think she overplays the Russia card, but, I'm glad she's out there to some extent, but I'm not a huge advocate of her positions. I'm going to wind it up because people are leaving, and I want to sign the books.
Thanks.
So thanks again.
Right on.